Welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Welcome to this episode of the Rethink Leadership podcast with my guest Rachel Shaw, the president and founder of Shaw HR Consulting in California. Rachel is an award-winning HR strategist and nationally recognized ADA compliance expert, and that relates to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Rachel has spent more than 20 years helping organizations and HR leaders create workplaces that are both legally sound and deeply human. She literally wrote the book on the subject, The Disabled Workforce, What the ADA Never Anticipated. As a successful female founder who's broken through glass ceilings in the HR industry, Rachel also brings a personal story of resilience and leadership, earning her multiple awards and recognition of one of the most respected voices in her field. We spend our time together talking about the overlooked side of diversity, equity and inclusion, and why disability inclusion is a critical piece of workplace equity and belonging, particularly when you consider the data behind it and the benefits it brings. This episode is in aid of Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, to which we've made a donation as a thank you to Rachel for joining us. This magnificent organisation continues to support those in war zones, trauma and medical need everywhere. Rachel, thank you very much for joining me. Please introduce yourself, your passions and your business.
Wonderful. Great to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. So I am Rachel Shaw, and I am a disability inclusion consultant. And I have spent my whole career helping organizations understand that both disability and caregiving isn't just side notes in the inclusion story, but they're the through line. So I help employers create programs and policies that help people with disabilities and caregiving needs to support them to have employees that can have that work-life balance and also produce the good work that helps companies thrive.
And that's great because around the world, we understand that a more diverse, inclusive workforce does work, although we've got a few bumps in the road at the moment in certain political systems and so on. How have you found it over the last sort of year or so, or even the last sort of 6 months or so, in keeping this message top of mind of the corporates and the organizations that you work with?
Yeah, I mean, DEI, especially in certain places, I primarily work in the United States, it's become almost a bad word. I think that progressive, very profitable companies know that, diverse C-suites are 22% more profitable. They know that disability inclusion and inclusion generally is great for the bottom line. It's not just a moral and ethical standard, but it is definitely something that has become out of favor. And so I think our language is changing around it, but we're really focusing. I always say I try to go for the hearts and the minds of my clients. Right now, I'm changing a lot less hearts, I think, so I'm focusing more on their minds. And bottom line is you want a successful, profitable business, and this isn't just about doing the right thing. It's also about good business. And so we know that when you have diversity in your workforce, we know that employees stay longer and they're happier. We know that it's very expensive to train and replace employees, and so you want retention. And so we know that there's a real financial reason for employers to care about diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, well said indeed. And I just hope more and more people think like you from that perspective too. It does occur to me, though, that you've got you're battling against other diversity lenses, whether it be that gender, race, sexuality, neurodivergent, etc., etc. So just take us back a little bit. What is the what and why behind your focus on disability inclusion?
Yeah. So, I mean, I fell into it. So in where I work, primarily, it's pretty new. I mean, believe it or not, it wasn't until the 90s that in the United States where I work, disability inclusion was even a requirement, which is, kind of amazing. I started doing this work in 98. And I think for me, I don't have personal experience. It wasn't something, a lived experience. But what I saw was generally a lot of employers don't want to hire others, right? They want to hire people that look like them, sound like them, believe like them, like their sports teams, go, football, your football, whatever football. And so what I found was this, my passion is to make sure that we're removing unnecessary barriers to give people equal access to employment. And so I saw very quickly how the way that we think about others, right? Whether it's a disabled person or someone who has a different belief system or a different ethnicity. I saw that employers are using their known or unknown biases to make very important decisions, because employment is one of the most important parts of most people's lives. It's so important, not only for your own existence, having a roof over your head, but solid employment, good employment can change generations. It can create generational wealth. It can create an opportunity and expectation for further generations. And we see that disabled people were having less access to employment, which isn't good for society. It's also not good for business. And so I got involved in this disability landscape in 1998. And there was nothing out there that told us how to do it. How do you support someone with a either visible or invisible disability, either gain employment or maintain employment if they become disabled during their work life? And so I spent my entire career since then creating policies and procedures and the how to teach employers how to remove bias, perception, preference out of their decision-making model by implementing a database decision process. And it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. It's a very dynamic landscape, but it works. And so that's what I do is I work with employers to change their hearts and minds through process and help them make database decisions, because people with disabilities is the talent you need on your workforce. And there's a lot of ways to find a yes to support someone to either get the job or keep the job that has a disability, need.
Data really sings, doesn't it, when you've got that underpinning everything. And I like the movement that you're making there from what to actually the how to. How do we implement it? How do we do it? How do we reduce bias to a point where we can be much more objective around these decisions that we're making? This may be a little bit unfair for me to throw this on you, but it did occur to me as you were talking there, is that we're moving into an era of more open talent. So a blended workforce where there are permanent employees and independent workers as the formalized part of our workforce, if you like. Has this impacted, changed the game for those in the workplace that are disabled and who can really focus on an area where their skill sets play to a strength?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's unknown. There's definitely some benefits to having more of a flexible schedule, to having more autonomy, to having, more the ability to work in a less structured environment. But there's also a lot that comes with that. I mean, for many people with disabilities, they need to have the structure and the protection of a job and medical benefits, and knowing that their environment, if they're an in-person employee or even remote employee, knowing that they have the ability to kind of manage that environment, whether it's physically modifying the environment or even modifying or managing their disability around leave or work hours. And so I do think that there's a potential for persons with disabilities who have more of the flexible, more of the ad hoc employment to be hurt more, because, if someone doesn't have regular employment, if an employer doesn't have an obligation to manage them, whether it's through due process or whether they have employment rights, I think that what employers may do is use an excuse of, we don't need you, when the reality is that maybe it's because that person had leave needs, or maybe their accommodation might cost the employer something to implement. So I worry when employers don't have to commit to an employee. I worry that could harm persons with disabilities more. But I do think there might be some interesting opportunities as we look at more flexible work models. I know that for a lot of folks, remote work has been very helpful to help disabled people stay employed. But I think it's a question that I have, and I'm not sure how it's gonna shake out at the very end.
No, neither am I, which is why I had to surprise you with that one. And thank you very much for considering that, because it still is a moving feast, really, as far as how that's going to bottom out. But there appear to be clear benefits of that. But of course, you rightly point out to the possible downsides as well, the no guarantees, etc., and who's going to be chosen. So if we go back to the core of what you've been talking about, and let's get back to your point about being data driven in this as well. What are the benefits of getting this right, and what examples can you share, Rachel?
Yeah, I mean, the benefits are you have to start with the premise and the belief that a diverse workforce is better, right? So having people that in my world that have a disability, have managed a disability, or living with a disability, are going to help you not only serve your clients, your customers better, but also be more profitable. And so you have to start with that belief that there is a benefit. In a lot of countries, there's also legal requirements. So if you don't accommodate, if you're not supporting a person with a disability to continue working if they can, and you get sued, there's impact to reputation, there's lawsuits, and of course that's very different depending on what country you're in. But in many countries, there's a litigation risk and a reputational risk if an employer fails to accommodate or support a disabled person to keep their employment. So that's kind of part of that story, of course, the why compliance matters and why you need to be concerned about it, and then also the profit area. But you want that talent, and so the way that kind of a life example of this is, let's say you have someone and this disability accommodations hit are what I call deskless workers, right? Our frontline workers, folks that might work in person or have more physically demanding jobs. We often can naturally accommodate disabilities a little bit more easily if someone is fully remote. But for those folks, and large majority of our workforce does have to show up or physically work and perform, whether it's driving a ride share, whether it's serving a coffee, or whether it's working in a warehouse or in a call center, or any of those other jobs that require us to show up. The way that we use data is for a lot of employees, especially if there's a physical component or a psychological component to their job that disability is impacting, employers are getting things like no heavy lifting, or they're getting no undue stress, or they're getting needs leave or breaks. And employers don't know what that means. And so in most employers, the dynamic is employers have more power than the employee. And so an employer may get that, whether it's a medical note that says no heavy lifting, for example, and the employer or the supervisor who's being asked, can you accommodate your employee? Let's say they're a custodian, right? Or, they're a food service worker. The employer might decide that no heavy lifting means they can't do their job, because in their brain, their employer brain, they may choose to think this job requires heavy lifting, they can't do it, and they're going to say, no, we can't accommodate. What my work does is my work creates a protocol or process where I tell employers, look, you don't get to use your power difference to define what you think that word means. You've got to pause, get into what we call the interactive process, and ask that healthcare provider, what is heavy? Is it 10 pounds lifting with their right hand, unrestricted lifting with their left hand, and the ability to lift if they're using both hands of, say, 50 pounds? That might, if that was the data point, the data we went from heavy to, 10 unrestricted and 50, we've now found a yes, because that job description or that job history shows us that 50 pounds is what's required. And what that process does is it equates the power difference a little bit better. And it allows the employee who may need and want their job very desperately, it allows them to at least make sure that it's not the employer. Because I'll tell you what, Jeremy, if I like you and I get heavy lifting and I value you and I really like you, I'm more likely as a manager, supervisor to say, yes, I can accommodate, than if I either don't like you or I believe that, I would prefer to have someone who's not limited or disabled. And so that's what I do. I work with employers to create consistent process so that they're not allowing their power difference to define, interpret, or decide whether or not someone's disability can be accommodated based on what they may believe, because we have known and unknown bias. We have preferences about whether or not we want disabled people in our workplace. So that's the work that I do and why data is so important.
Thank you. And looking at that a little bit deeper, are there any organizations that you can point to that get this really right? And how does that manifest itself in benefits?
Yeah. So, I mean, I can talk about one client who we've published an article together. So this is a United States client, but they're a transportation agency. So Los Angeles Metropolitan Transportation Agency, they brought me in around 2016, and they were having a lot of issues. So they're bus drivers primarily, and everything that goes around bus driving. So you got to show up to drive a bus, right? And you got to physically be able to do that. So they were seeing high levels of litigation. They were seeing, millions of dollars of losses. And they were having huge impacts with their relationships with their employees and their union. So nothing was working. It was causing them money. They were, and the reason is these were really good people. I believe the managers and supervisors were good people, but they were using with permission, their power difference. So when they got a restriction like no pushing, no forceful pushing and pulling, or no heavy lifting, or no repetitive bending, their brains were telling them, you can't be a bus operator if you can't do that. And they were simply saying no. And that was resulting in a couple things. Employees were feeling that they couldn't trust their managers. They just wanted to fire them. They were seeing high levels of litigation. They were seeing high levels of grievances and issues with their unions who represent their employees. And so what we did is, the first thing we did when we came in is we looked at their program, and the first thing we said is, you're making decisions based on, this is a very official HR term, so I apologize to your listeners if you're not in HR, but they were making decisions based on crappy data. Right? Sorry, bad joke. But it was terrible. So the first thing we did is we just said, look, we're going to pause, and we're not going to make a decision that could impact this person's job. These are good jobs. These are jobs that come with pensions. These are jobs that come with healthcare benefits for them and their families. These are jobs for people that are well-paid positions. And you're going to simply take that job away for someone who may not have a lot of experience doing other things, because people in this industry, they stay in this industry their whole career, often. And so we just started getting good data. And what we saw over the next couple of years is we don't see litigation. We haven't had lost lawsuits. The unions believe in this process. They support it. They attend these meetings. And this is a high volume accommodation. I mean, this company has hundreds of disability related accommodations, hundreds of leave related needs every year. I mean, this is a high volume disability, interactive process program. And yet our unions trust us. They understand what we're doing. They do their job, and they make sure we're doing our job. But the client is not seeing litigation. They've saved money. Their reputation has been improved. And instead of focusing on all this energy and time on the conflict of disagreement, instead they can take that time and energy and focus on the operations and getting ready for the World Cup and the next Olympics, right? Which is what they're in the process of doing now. So, I mean, not only was it financially profitable, but it also improved employee-employer relationships, and employees trust us. And so they're coming to meetings, they're talking with us, and that's what it's all about, right? And they don't say yes all the time. There's unfortunately a lot of bus operators that still cannot be accommodated. But the difference with data is, if I say no, and I essentially medically separate you because you can't return as a bus operator, and it says no forceful pushing and pulling, you might not agree with me, and you might feel like I am harming you, as opposed to if the healthcare provider has defined forceful as no pushing or pulling more than 20 pounds of force using both hands. And we know that to assist a wheelchaired passenger on and off a bus, it takes 42 pounds of force. That bus operator now knows I can't return. And they have a better chance of accepting that decision and moving forward, instead of feeling like they've been harmed. They understand that unfortunately their disability won't let them come back. And so that's the power of data. It fixes all components, all four corners of your process, and it creates a better work environment and more trust, which is more important, which is critically important in a workplace.
Yeah, I've been furiously writing notes as you've been eloquently going through this example, and what a great example it was. That points that, of course, it's some of the intangibles maybe for some organizations that relate to this, like reputation management, cost management, better efficiencies, trust, a huge one, commitment and engagement from your employees, happiness in the workplace as well. And all of those then contribute not just to the efficiency side, but also actually the service that we're providing to our customers. And on the flip side of what you said there, which is the crappy data, which is what I like, the conscious bias, which is there, but going through the minds, I read this, therefore it's this, therefore you can't. So it's that negative perception, first of all, which for me raises the flag of untrained management, lack of HR leadership. And as you were talking then, it raised another question in my mind, which is, therefore, if we're going to get this right, how important is it to engage organizational leadership into this, not just HR? And how do they go about, stepping into this a little bit more to show other people the way?
Yeah. I will say leadership usually gets involved and excited about this issue if they've had a significant legal loss, or if they're seeing an impact on, if they are believers and they understand the data that a disabled workforce is actually a more profitable workforce if managed, right? A diverse workforce. And so oftentimes though, leadership gets excited when there's some sort of hit to the bottom line or the profit. But regardless, for what, whatever is the reason that it's finally getting to HR to fix, HR absolutely has to have leadership behind them, because human resources job is to protect the organization. And that means that if they're doing their job well, they're not giving management what it wants. They're not giving employees necessarily what they want. They're implementing policies, procedures, and compliance obligations. And that means that they're holding everybody accountable. They're making sure that power difference is more equated so that we're making sure that good decisions are made and people are treated consistently. And so the biggest issue is this is a solution I believe that HR is tasked with, but they have to be given permission. And sometimes, not always, and every organization is different, but sometimes management doesn't want HR to do this right. They want that power, whether they're admitting it or not. They want to be able, some employers don't, they think that people with disabilities or injuries are more likely to cost them more likely to take more leave, more likely to get injured again. And so what we have to do is really make sure that even if there are preferences in terms of whether or not certain people are accommodated, that we're given basically the permission to implement consistent process and to do the right thing. We're going to accommodate people with disabilities who are the most amazing employees in the organization, but we're also going to accommodate employees with disabilities if they can do their full job, even if they're the most miserable employee in the whole organization, right? And that's what's so important, is sometimes we see people treated differently based on the employee's perceived value by supervisors, managers, or even leadership of the organization. So that's the key. The key is that this has to be something where HR knows they've got a strong backbone, but they know that the top leadership has their back and is going to let them do the right thing, because that protects the organization at the end of the day.
Excellent. And of course, for me, that leads to another question about the leaders themselves and the duty of care that leaders themselves have. So let's assume that that those tuning in here, they're to this podcast, they're thinking they may have staff with disabilities, or they may be looking to hire staff and they found out they have disabilities. They know in their heart of hearts that they need to get better at doing this. What could be three kind of the small right actions for them to take which help them accelerate progress in this area themselves?
Yeah. They need to create, I think that all employers need to look at the realities of what their workforce needs. There are employers that never get any requests for accommodation. And so, if you don't have a problem, you don't need to fix it, right? If your workplace is already allowing someone to simply self-manage their disability issue, then there's nothing you need to do. But I think the first thing for employers who are seeing an impact, whether it's high workers' compensation leaves, whether it is work injuries, whether it is high levels of leave usage, whether it's protected leave, or whether it's, people calling out sick, or whether they're seeing an impact in the workplace where people are getting injured doing work, whatever it is, I think they need to look at, okay, what is what is happening? Are we having high levels of lost time? And then are we having a high cost of work injuries? And they need to create a program kind of around that. And I think that's the first thing, is understand your problem and what you're trying to solve for. How do you support? Because at the end of the day, it is about supporting employees with disabilities to do their full job, right? And so how do we balance that inclusion goal with also the workplace goals that we have for all employees? I think the second thing they need to do is make sure that they've got an HR team that's trained. I spend my entire life training HR people, really, really good people who care deeply. But most HR folks, I don't care if you have a PhD, you're not going to learn HR from a degree. Great, get a degree. I'm not saying education is not important, but HR isn't on the job learning. You learn from doing and screwing up and getting better. And so a lot of times employers don't have enough exposure to this stuff to have learned, or they were trained by someone who was trained by someone who was trained by someone. And so we have a real lack of expertise. And so who's harmed when HR is not well trained? employees with disabilities or employees who need whatever service HR is not trained to do, and the organization. So we need to invest in making sure our teams are trained based on the solution we need. So again, don't overthink it. If you have a very small disability accommodation need, don't overthink it. And then I think the third thing is employers really need to make sure that they're understanding and training their managers and supervisors to recognize and accept that we all have preferences in hiring, evaluating and promoting. And we have to understand that sometimes with certain types of disabilities or certain types of work groups, for some supervisors, they're going to have bias that's going to guide their decision making. And we have to make sure that even if we in HR are doing our very best to remove bias by bringing data in, we have to also make sure that we're training our supervisors and managers to recognize their own internal biases or perceptions or preferences, right? This doesn't mean they're bad people, and to really counter, to train them to not make decisions based on maybe their gut preferences or their gut decisions, but really make sure that they understand the organization's inclusion goals, the organization's policies, procedures, and really understand that they're part of making sure that we don't make discriminatory or inappropriate decisions that are going to harm our bottom line, which is, at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. So it's management that focus on support rather than supervision, so that everybody, no matter their status, has a chance to perform and reach their goals, supported by an HR who are engaged in expertise in this area. And an awareness and even acknowledgement, I guess, of the biases that we're all going to be dealing with day in, day out, so that we can start to be more objective with the decisions that we're making. Is that a fair summary of that, Rachel?
Yeah, it's great.
Okay, well, what a great conversation. And I'm absolutely sure that many of those tuning in will want to find out more and connect and continue the discussion. How do they do that?
Well, easiest way is reach out to me at rachelshaw.com, and you can send me a message or find out about our services. But love to chat with anyone interested in evaluating or improving their disability culture or disability programming.
Great. Well, thank you. And so everybody get in touch with Rachel, rachelshaw.com. And Rachel, a huge thank you from me for joining us, raising the awareness of this area, something that we don't talk enough of, I think, in business, and particularly at leadership level, and the challenge that HR may have in this area too. You've given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing it to your audience. I think it's a great thing to think about, so I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment, and support us on your favourite platform, and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.